answered so that Islamic society Islamic society functions precisely as by the Quran, in calculating inheritances and so on and so forth, in calculating other things between businesses and so on. So he answered, in answer to the demands of the faith, he wrote his book. He says it himself in his introduction to make it easy for them. Take, for instance, cartography. Why did Muslims develop maps and so on, the first sophisticated maps? It's precisely to help pilgrims go to Mecca. So the Muslim geographers had to devise precise maps. If you go from Portugal to Mecca, you have to know how to go there. If you come from the frontiers of China, you have to go there. If you come from here. And so Muslim scholars spent years and years. There is this here. And the first and most sophisticated and earliest descriptions of the world are by Muslim geographers. You can check this again in the library if you want. The first conclusions that the earth is round again came from Muslims at the time when if you said that the earth was round, elsewhere you would be burnt alive. The Muslims believed in this centuries before everybody else. They had understood it already. If you look at all the names of mountains, tides, things, seas, how they interconnected, again, all these are to Muslims. Even Christopher Columbus later on was able to go to America by using Muslim know-how. He wouldn't have done it. Where did Christopher Columbus go to America? He didn't go from England or Scandinavia or Greece. He came here. Who was here? Muslims, Muslim learning. Scholars will say, it's by coincidence. Everything they tell you is by coincidence. The best knowledge of the seas before here was here. Who was here? The Muslims. Who was here? The Muslim geographer Al-Idrisi, who made the first representation of the world as it was at the time. And you can go on. If you look at astronomy, I mentioned earlier on why the needs of the faith, exactly to do when Ramadan starts, Eid, the song, times for Salah, you have to study these things. And that's why Muslim devised the first precise astronomical tables. You look at, again, architecture. It was the same thing because the orientation of the mosque and so on, the solidity of the building and so on and so forth. So they had to find ways and methods. And Islam has always been practical faith. Unlike Greeks, you take the problems of society and you deal with it, and then you find answers in science to answer the practical side. Take, for instance, why did Muslims develop cotton, textile industry? It's again something in the faith. You cannot go and do your prayers with the same piece of cloth you wear for 20 years. You have to keep changing. You have to do it. Why did they invent soap? It's again because as a need of the faith, you have to wash your hands and so on and so forth. And so you look, why do we save water? Why did Islam, unlike today Muslim society, why is Islam a green thing? It's again the fundamentals of the faith. You have to plant trees, you have to take care of water, you have to keep yourself clean, you have to keep water clean. Water is precious resources and so on and so forth. Our problems began when we began to set aside these things. You understand? This is the thing. And we can go on and on and on how Islamic civilization owes precisely to the fundamentals in answer to what the faith demanded, not just in seeking learning and so on and so forth, but practical answers. Now, you can also look at the matter of decline, that is supposedly, or that Muslim civilization was brilliant just after the appearance of it. However, when Islamic power was destroyed in the 13th century, this is the time when the decline began. When the Mongols destroyed Muslim, when the Crusaders arrived and destroyed Muslim colleges and so on and so forth, and other factors as well. Today, yes, there are problems with Muslim society and Muslim rule and so on. We can debate them these at the end, why Muslim society is in difficulty today. But these have nothing to do with Islam. Because simply, I don't think Mubarak's rule or what people like him are Islamic in any way. They have imposed Islamic rule. You cannot blame it on Islam. So people would come, look at the mess in Egypt. Look at what they call it, the best people persecuting their lack of democracy. Yes, it's not because of Muslims. It's not an Islamic rule. It has nothing to do with Islam. And you see, this is the problem. It is attributing to Islam what Islam has nothing to do with. And yet, what Islam was responsible for, that's positive, this is set aside. And If we move, we might return to this point if you want later on for a discussion. We go to the third point of distortion, that Islam was spread by the sword. Again, here another historian who denounced this fallacy, Djazairi or Larry, he's not particularly keen on Islam, but he's a historian, and he read, and he can tell you that this idea that Islam was spread is completely nonsense. And yet you hear it. You again switch television today, you will hear this thing, that Islam was spread by sword. I heard this personally last week. Now, if you look at history, I was reading a Western historian, Rogerson, who was making fun of this idea that Islam was spread by the sword, and he was quoting some. He said, it is, as you, sorry, before I talk about his quote, if you listen to what the EDL or some BNP people, they tell you that Islam was spread, the Quran in one hand and the sword in the other. And Rogerson was saying, they said this couldn't be possible, because you cannot fight holding the Quran with one hand and the sword with another. It's impossible. The second thing, you will have to have tens of thousands of copies of the Quran, because Muslim, you can't, every soldier, you can't do it, you see. Third, historically it's impossible, because at the time Muslims were spreading, paper wasn't invented yet in the Muslim world. So how could they carry the thing? It makes no sense, because Muslims spread in the 7th century, whilst paper was invented late in the 8th century for the first time in Baghdad and so on and so forth. So it doesn't make any sense at all. So you see, even if you take some basic fundamentals of history, you find that it's... Now if you look at it from another angle, you look at Africa. How did many countries in Africa or Malaysia, Indonesia and so on become Muslim? No soldier, no Muslim soldier ever set foot in Malaysia or Indonesia. And yet Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world. So this idea that Islam was spread by the sword makes no sense at all. Islam was mainly spread, or as Draper says in his things, he said the sword might work a little, but the sword is not the solution, and we see it today. It is the example, as you all know, of Muslim behavior. When the people in Africa, when the people in Indonesia saw how Muslims behaved superiorly to others, not that they were superior arrogant, but better behavior. People who stuck to their word, people who were clean, people who didn't steal, people with who did business with probity, obeying their contracts and so on. And they compared them to the Portuguese and the Dutch, who were there. The Portuguese and the Dutch were killing people left and right, whilst the Muslims, they didn't have one single soldier. And the Indonesians and Malaysians, despite all the terror inflicted on them, adopted Islam. So it is our behavior. Again, we see here today, unfortunately, again, as I said, as Muslims, we need to raise, me included, obviously, as I keep saying it, our levels of behavior, because it is the example that you live. That's what is called. It is not preaching to the others, going to them, this is what Islam is, this is what they do, pushing down their words. That doesn't work, as far as I know. It is good to let them know, let them read, let them know, but it is through the behavior, through the example. I can tell you this as a historian. This is what had an impact all over history. It is people, Muslims just behaved as they were told to behave, and that did the trick. People obviously came and asked about the Quran and read. And this was the role of the imams to explain, this is what this is clarifying things. And that's it. So it was by example. Why did the Spaniards, who were hundreds of years, the Visigoths and the Romans tried to convert, didn't succeed? The Muslims, just a few thousand men crossed into Spain, and the whole of Spain, millions of people then became Muslim. It's when they saw what Muslims brought in terms of civilization, personal conduct and so on, banning everything. Why did the Egyptians become Muslims? One of the first things that the Muslims did, the General Amr ibn al-As, when he entered Egypt, and he wrote to the Caliph Amr ibn al-Khattab, one of the practices that the Egyptians used to do was to sacrifice young women to the Nile to have. And the Muslims, as soon as they came, they stopped it. Amr ibn al-As, there was an exchange between the Muslim General Amr ibn al-As and Amr ibn al-Khattab, the Caliph. And after a few exchanges, they did a few changes. And the Egyptians, this was one instance about the humanity of this religion. So when people mention the things, the violence, this plus many others, abolition taxes, injustices, persecution, and so on and so forth, the Egyptians and others compare the rule of Islam with that of their predecessors and adopted Islam. It's the same thing in North Africa, where I come from. Here, before Islam arrived, there used to be some of the leading figures of Christianity, such as St. Augustine. What converted the North Africans to Islam? It's only a few thousands of Muslims who came. It was again what Islam brought: the change, social justice, the probity, kindness, cleanliness, the civilization, everything you can think of, honor, equality, and all the things. And also, as I keep repeating, the behavior of the Muslims who came. When the Muslims here, the whole region plus Spain, everybody could see the greatness of that faith. You see, this is the thing. So it is up to Muslims today to understand the message from history, that it is we, by what we do every day, or try to do, what we try to convey, that who can do better work than anything else. And in this, as Sister mentioned last week, each of us can do a lot by just trying. Obviously, we'll never be perfect. None of us will ever be. We all have imperfections and weaknesses, but at least doing as much as possible to inspire and to be as good as we can. And finally, I would like to finish today on the point of Islam and whether Muslims are hostile to the other faith. Again, here we've got the witness from some scholars who studied the matters and who also think that the idea that you hear up to this day, I'm sure you hear it all the time, that we Muslims and Islam hates Jews and Christians, we don't want anybody, we just, anybody is the enemy, and so on and so forth. If you look at what Daniel says, or what Davenport says, here, these are some of the people who studied the history, as they tell you, it was in Islam that the idea of tolerance and respect for the others was found. Islam led in this. No other culture beat the Muslims to it. In the medieval times, when if you had a different religion, anywhere you were persecuted and hounded, only in the Muslim world you could find non-Muslims thriving. Only the Muslims offered the security to other religions. When the Jews were persecuted, sorry, I would like to finish first with this. Even Bernard Lewis, I don't know whether you've heard of Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis doesn't like Islam at all. And yet, even he accepts this. And he says it. Because when he looks at it in history, Bernard Lewis, if you watch him on TV today, he's always talking about Islamic values. But when he looks at history, he accepts that only under Islam were other minorities tolerated and were able to survive, and even to survive for their life. Here I would like to go, I was mentioning about the Jews, for instance. When the Jews were persecuted all over Europe, they escaped here, there, and mainly here to Turkey. Because under Muslim rule, they knew they were safe. Christian groups themselves preferred to live under Turkish rule than other Christian rulers. They used to escape wherever here the Turks were present. Christians used to go and escape and live under Turkish rule. Even if you take the Greek Orthodox Church, although the Turks took Byzantium, the Greek Orthodox Church was preserved by the Turks. Because if Byzantium remained, Byzantium used to be Orthodox, the Catholic here, the papacy, wanted to get rid of the Orthodox Church. And it was the Ottomans who, by preserving the Greek Orthodox until Russia arose, because once Russia became a power, then it could protect the Greek Orthodox Church, or the Orthodox Church. Because the Russians believe in the Orthodox Christianity. In the West, it's different. But if you take any other minority, whether Protestant, whether Catholic, whoever, they could find here safety. Or another thing, the idea of having Christian and Jewish ministers in your government. Nobody could have thought of this in the Middle Ages. The Muslims were the only says